This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Kristen Radtke. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we have the pleasure of talking with Kristen Radtke. Her new book, Imagine Wanting Only This, comes out today, in fact, from Pantheon Books. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But there are times when you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. And this month isn't every month. You can check out their bundles where they offer deeper discounts on multiple comics from the same publisher. You can check out bundles from DC, Marvel, and Valiant in the April offers at DCB Service.
That's right. Every single month they have great specials. You have to go to the website and check out what they are. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, this was a fun conversation with Kristen, talking about her new book. And not only because we talked in depth about this book, but also, I mean, she's a relatively young, I don't know if we want to call her, in light of our conversation, a graphic novelist or an essayist in comics, but she had some really interesting views on the work that she does from a perspective of kind of, relatively speaking, just starting out.
Yeah, and to start out the gate with a graphic novel like Imagine Wanting Only This, and having it come out from Pantheon is a great achievement for and I think well deserving for this book. I really appreciated this book, and it's one of the rare instances where I read a book completely through and then went back and reread it again almost immediately. Yeah,
it is one that I think warrants multiple readings in order to put the pieces together, because given the nature, I think, of the subject matter, which we talk about extensively in this interview, it goes in not necessarily a meandering way, but kind of drifting from one topic to the next. Going back and rereading a second and even a third time, you start to see the larger structure that she's imposing over her topic, and I really did appreciate where she was going here.
Yeah. So I'm really glad we got a chance to talk to her on the eve of the release of this book, and I highly recommend it to our listeners.
Let's go ahead and listen to our conversation then.
Yes. We're here today with Kristen Radtke, whose new book, Imagine Wanting Only This, comes out this week from Pantheon. So, Kristen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I want to start with, kind of jumping right into the book, which I really enjoyed, is the book starts with two events in your life. One, the the death of your beloved Uncle Dan from this congenital heart problem, and your exploration of ruins in Gary, Indiana, especially a church, where you find these photographs taken by someone named Seth. Where do you see the connection between those two events as the places where this narrative begins?
Yeah, it took me a long time, I think, to see the connection. For a long time, I was just writing about both of these things, and I didn't totally understand how related they were. I think for me, the connection sort of developed over time when I recognized how similar sort of the explorations were. I mean, certainly a building or a town can decay in the same way, a body can, and we can sort of look for answers in a similar way. But what do you guys think? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I'm interested that you turn that question back around, because it's, one of the feelings I got when I got the end of this book is the book is about, what do we leave behind? Whether it's what we as individuals leave behind, or in bigger terms, what a culture leaves behind, and that these things, no matter what, are going to go away.
Right. And in fact, in especially the last half of your book, George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, I just could not get it out of my head.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And, I see it similarly in that in looking over this book, there seems to be, I guess, if you want to call it a tripartite upon which everything is structured. And, one is your Uncle Dan and his story. Then along with that, your exploration of the heart disease that he and members of your family have. And then the other leg of that would be Seth Thomas, the urban explorer, the photographer, who is also interested, you learned, in decay and places that have been abandoned. And then I guess the third leg would be this larger theme of decay, ruins, and abandonment that kind of brings everything together. And it's the latter that, and this is not a spoiler in any way, but it's the latter tone that you end on with this just looking in kind of a meditative manner. In fact, I wanted to ask you, my use of the word meditative is specific and intentional here, because in looking at descriptions of this book from the publicity department and others who have written blurbs for it, they call it a memoir, which it is, and I have no problem with that. But I saw this book as much more of a meditation in more of a literary sense, maybe a longer graphic novel equivalent of a lyric poem, in that you use your own life and events surrounding it, your friends, your family, upon which to explore these larger issues that, like that Andy pointed out, that things don't last, that the things that we leave behind may leave traces, but even those may fade after a while. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting to hear you say that. It's certainly how I feel about the book. I mean, I think the designation of memoir is sort of just like a marketing category,
right?
Or a shelving category, for where it'll go in the bookstore. I was definitely, I feel like in grad school, I went to grad school for nonfiction writing, and memoir became this sort of dirty word very quickly. It was like less serious or something than essay, and I was very resistant to the term, which I think is silly. Like people can call my work anything they want, it's fine. That to me is not ultimately as sort of interesting of a question, but I think what is interesting is how people read it so differently.
So what have been some of the different responses that you've gotten that may have surprised you from people like you're alluding to here?
Well, it's interesting to hear you. I mean, I feel like comics guys and comics people are more like, oh, this feels, more like a long lyric poem, or this feels more like a book length essay or something. When I think you guys are like the third group of comics people that have said that, and I haven't heard that so much from the sort of literary, the sort of like straight prose literary readers. Which is, I have no idea what to think of that. It's just very interesting to me.
What kind of reaction have they been giving you?
I don't know if we've even talked so much about genre. I mean, the response has been largely very, very nice and very gracious. Like, I've been very grateful for it, and it's been very generous, more so than I thought. I think, you know, you have these things in mind when you're making a book, and you're like, I'm definitely going to get called up for this, or this drawing is totally not working, or, you know, you have all these self-consciousnesses and all of these sort of points of nervousness or embarrassment, and you're just like waiting for someone to call them out.
Yeah,
it's
interesting.
It's been largely more positive than I expected.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say this because, you know, Andy and I, and we met in graduate school, and both of us have, I guess you could call, more traditional literary backgrounds. And so that's where we're coming from, but we're also coming from comic scholarship. And one of the things I found is those, you know, either inside or even outside of the academy who do something with literature or literary studies, many times if they're unfamiliar with comics or graphic novels, they don't know what to do with it. They may appreciate it, but they don't know how to call it or frame it. And so sometimes I found it interesting to listen to the words that they use to describe a comic or a graphic novel, if you want to call it that.
I completely agree with that.
Since we're on this subject of genre, I mean, I think one of the points in the book that really kind of unlocked my thinking about the book was later on when you're delivering your paper on Chris Marker at the conference in Iceland, which I first of all, I love as a representation of a academic conference, because there's like 3 people in the audience, totally, and it just and
you
word
flew
bubbles
like to a literal different country for 3 people. Yeah.
But also that, I mean, this hurt my old man eyes to zoom in on your paper. Like, you've got a little representation of your paper that I could read, but the idea of what Chris Marker's doing in something like Sans Soleil and other works that not only plays around with genre in film, but also is self-consciously commenting on the fact that it's doing it. Was Marker an important part of the way you thought about doing? Are you trying to do, in other words, something like he does in film with comics?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I feel like I didn't know how to. Someone asked me recently, "Oh, do you use film as a sort of inspiration for how to frame comics and draw comics?" And I sort of thought, "Oh my God, I should have been using film as an inspiration for how to draw comics. Like, why didn't I ever think of that?" You know, it's sort of this, because so much of it too, because I was not trained in comics, was just, how do I represent this so that it's not the same thing every panel? You know, how do I, like, you know, at first even learning to switch angles or to draw from a different side was new, and sort of took some time to figure out. So I don't necessarily think that but certainly as a writer, I thought a lot about Chris Marker when I was just writing the text. I love his narrations. I love the way he paces things. I mean, he's just a really extraordinary thinker.
Well, okay, what was the genesis behind the book? Or maybe another way of asking this, at what point during these events that you lay out, especially in the first couple of chapters, did you think, I've got to deal with this in more of a long form story?
During graduate school, probably. So at the point sort of when I was giving the paper, you know, when I was presenting the paper on Chris Marker in Iceland, and certainly when I wrote about Kentucky, when I was living in Kentucky, I was working on the project then. But it took me a while to figure out really what it was. You know, I mean, in graduate school, I was just writing essays, and then I had to put them together in some way in a thesis. And I definitely wanted to make it a full-length book, but I just thought, you know, my sort of pitch was a collection of essays about abandonment or abandoned places and hidden histories and ruined places. You know, it was just like sort of very topic driven. And it took me a while to figure out how to weave, you know, the personal and things into it, which was not my impulse. That was definitely my editor's suggestion.
I think there's a lot of areas when I was reading the book that I just felt like I was connecting with personally. And, you know, one of them being, you know, your your ability to capture what an academic conference is like, but also what graduate school is like, what kind of how all these ideas are brand new, and you're trying to figure out, everybody's trying to figure out and articulate how where they fit. Some people will say things like, that Ulysses is a prank.
Right.
and I remember having those conversations. So I felt like that is definitely what grad school is like.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad I got it right.
But okay.
No, I was going to say, maybe along with that, and not that this is necessarily linked to our experiences with graduate school, but you also do a really good job in, I guess, visually representing boredom and ennui, and just frustration, even depression, because there are a variety of moments in the book. For instance, when you're in Louisville, where it's almost as if you decompress the time and you string out, sometimes with repetitive images within a series of panels, in order to show time going slowly, because there's really nothing to engage you. And this feeling of forlornness, I think, goes hand in hand with some of these larger themes that you get to in the book on decay, ruin, and abandonment.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear you say this. I mean, that's definitely just how the time felt for me. There just didn't seem to be any other way that I could represent it other than just those repetitive panels, because that's, to me, just how, if I look back, that's just how the time was.
One of the other, I mean, Louisville is an area of connection too. But one of the other things, I mean, Derek and I went to grad school at Purdue in Indiana. Mm-hmm. And while I was there, person I was going to get married to, my wife was living in Milwaukee for the first year. So I drove every other weekend from West Lafayette, Indiana to Milwaukee. So Gary, Indiana was definitely a place I went through and avoided or went through as fast, I guess, as I could. Yeah. So that when I read that idea about exploring Gary was not something that would have occurred to me, I guess, at the time, 25 or so years ago. But so what was it about, being in Chicago, wanting to explore Gary in the first place?
I really stumbled into Gary. I mean, it was really I think even my boyfriend at the time was making films and was making paintings, and I think he was really more of the directed one, and I was a little bit more along for the ride. And so it took me a while to sort of think. I mean, it was years before I did anything with that trip. I never thought I'd really write about it, or I thought we'd do some sort of collaborative project, which never happened. But it was all very abstract to me. I really didn't. I didn't contextualize it in any way, and I didn't absorb it in any way for years.
Well, either with that experience or maybe with some of the others that we see in Imagine Wanting Only This, did you fictionalize anything? I mean, I'm assuming that you changed some names around to protect the innocence, so to speak.
I changed names. Yeah. The only thing I really changed around was time. Every once in a while, like it made more sense for something to be a bit more compressed, or the time frame, the timeline was maybe, but it was more or less correct. Just I remember I had a teacher in college talk about writing time like an accordion, where things are sped up and slowed down based on sort of how they serve the narrative, and I think that's probably what I did.
Yeah, because I was wondering particularly about the Seth Thomas photographs. I mean, so you actually did find photographs in that same context in an abandoned church.
Yeah.
And I appreciated the fact that you show us what some could call maybe a thoughtless or a callous side of you.
Yeah.
And just, saying, okay, well, I'll return them at some point, but not feeling pressed to do so.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what happened. And I hope that a lot of that has to do with age. I was very young, but I think, we're thoughtless in all kinds of ways, kind of no matter how old we are.
But there's also a sense, and I've had this sense myself, that when you enter an abandoned place, that it's free, right? Like it's
right,
there for everybody. And so, I've taken magazines out of abandoned houses and stuff like that, and maybe should have felt guilty, but I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
True podcast confessions.
Yeah. Well, didn't find. I was hoping to find comic books, and I didn't. So, so one of the sets of questions I was thinking about is where it kind of started from with this. Where do these events connect? And you were talking about compressing timelines and things like that, because one of the reasons why this came up is that I think this book really demands of the reader an active engagement with the things that you're presenting here, and trying to find out figuring out how all these things connect in a good way, in a positive reading experience way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and one of the big kind of sections of the book deals with the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, which was amazing to read about in your book, because it's so unknown through most of the rest of the country. Outside of Wisconsin, that doesn't get this. And even again, I asked my wife; she helped me. I think I pronounced Peshtigo right.
You did. You're rarely is it pronounced right. Most people say Peshtigo.
Yeah. So she helped me out with that, but she didn't know about the fire growing up in Milwaukee. But what you seem to start with like a family connection with that, but then. What kind of drove you to go kind of past the history of the fire and dig into like what its future impact would be or might have been?
That was, I think, sort of late. It's sometimes, I feel like so many projects start in a really sort of baseline, simple, banal way. Like, I need to write an essay for a workshop right now, and I'm 23, and isn't this history weird and intense and overwhelming? And then you get inside of it, and it sort of takes over, and you find it sort of creeping into your life in a way you didn't expect. And I think that's really what happened. I was writing about it I spent several months writing an essay and thought that was sort of it. And then thought, okay, maybe this will fit into my book, and started working on it in that way. And it was really in that sort of time frame when I started thinking about how these moments, everyone talks about in the Chicago fire how it's so good that the Chicago fire happened for the future of Chicago, because Chicago was designed so insanely at first, and it gave them a chance to start over kind of on a grid. And I started thinking about, Peshtigo and what Peshtigo could have been. It's now a microscopically small town, but it was really a sort of center of logging and trading at the time, and thinking sort of how that would have changed my upbringing and how different things would have looked in the town, the town where I grew up was really interesting to me.
So I agree. This just was another area of connection, because I grew up for a time in a town in North Dakota called Christine, which had 60 people in it. And it was like 30 miles south of Fargo. And there was a legend in the town that the town had burned down in the 19th century. And it would have been Fargo if it hadn't burned down.
Right.
And it makes me wonder how many kind of places are there out there like that have these legends of what might have been about them if they had if they had survived, or if they hadn't gone through some trauma.
Well, I think so much of history is also accidental, and these things just happen, and then history gets shifted. The things are getting rewritten and changed. There was the French town, which I won't even try to pronounce, that was accidentally bombed because it looked like the name of the town of another town they had meant to bomb. There's just all of these things where these sort of accidental tragedies, where things just suddenly are irrevocably different.
I mean, Or do you plan to continue, or do you have future plans to investigate other such areas, maybe, like Peshtigo or Gilman, as you do in the book?
Yeah, I feel pretty done with it for now. But I think some people are really capable of staying inside something for 10 years or something. And I admire those kinds of writers so much, but I feel really a need to move on right now. And it's perhaps something that will, I think the themes that I'm interested in will be in everything, the sort of restlessness, this abandonment, dealing with grief and, sort of the impermanence of things. I think that will be everywhere, but I'm interested in sort of exploring it in a different way, I think.
So how long were you working on this project as, kind of from beginning to now?
Yeah, that's a really hard question because I was working on it so much in grad school and I didn't totally know that I was working on it. So probably all in all about 5 years, but give or take some time.
Do you see that, you said like getting deep into something for 10 years, do you see about like 5 years as maybe the place that you can... I think this book, I'm hoping, check back in with me in 5 years, but I think that this book has taken me longer than a new book will. I'm working on a new project now and I have more of a vision for it than I did. This book too, I was also teaching myself how to draw. I started as prose and then I started working in graphic form. I rewrote it so many times. And so much of that was just about learning the form. So, and not to say that my style won't change and that the way I'm drawing isn't changing and things like that, but I so much of the book too was not knowing that I could make a book. And now I know I at least made one.
Well, Kristen, so much of your work in comics has a nonfiction aspect to it. We've been talking about this new book as well, whether you want to call it a meditation or a memoir, whatever. It's nonfiction, but also the work that you've done for, let's say, the Oxford and then the Daily Beast, where you either do comics essays or, and I particularly find this interesting, the reviews where you do a book review in comic form. Is this a particular kind of writing, nonfiction, within comics that you see yourself sticking with for the foreseeable future?
I think so. I really like doing that. I haven't done one in a while because I was on book deadline. I haven't done a review in a while, but for me, it's just a really fun and interesting way to approach a book. And I also feel like once you start working in a certain mode, that's just how you're thinking automatically. So I'm not thinking anymore in terms of how can I craft an argument with paragraphs. I see it sort of unfolding in panels. And so it's frustrating sometimes to shift back and forth. And it's really more enjoyable to sort of stay in the comics mode because that's what I've been working in. But yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think as long as magazines, want to keep publishing them, I will certainly write them.
When I was talking earlier about the academic conference scene in the book, one of the things that comes up there that I think you're doing interestingly and kind of runs through the book too, but is this that you're presenting at the conference. We get your word balloons with your presentation. They fade away, and the text becomes about Seth again, coming back. And was there something about the ability for comics to be able to juxtapose two different threads like that? A visual and verbal thread that don't match?
Yeah, that's to me so interesting. There are braided essays and things that move back and forth, in very short bursts, but you can't necessarily engage with two things at once in the same way that you can in comics with two ideas at once, in exactly the same moment. I do think that there's a way to do something very similar in prose. Like I resist the idea that one form is superior to the other for a certain subject. Like I think we can do that in any form, but I am very interested in how it works in comics, and it's one thing that I love doing. It's also something that I find really challenging. Like it takes a while to stumble upon that so that it doesn't feel forced.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that, because it's one of the things that I struggle with when I teach comics is to try to resist saying comics does this better than something else.
Exactly.
Or something else. Prose can't do what comics do when it just may be rarer that prose does it.
Yeah. Yeah. Or in a slightly different form.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of pulling at the Chris Marker thing a little further. Then are you finding, is there something about like the way that critics talk about and try to find a way to talk about his work, and about the video essay, which is another thing that you've been involved in, I think, with especially with your work with Triquarterly, that can translate into being able to talk about something like Imagine Wanting Only This, or another graphic novel that kind of rides these lines between memoir and essay.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think we sort of get hung up on naming, which I think I certainly did. And I think part of that comes from the sort of grad school thing where you want to like stick your flag in the land that you stand on and the genre that you're writing from, and say that it's different, you know. But also part of grad school, I think, was we always just used the term essay for anything we thought was good, because that was that was the superior form, you know. So, you know, a building was an essay, a video was an essay, you know, sculpture was an essay. And there are certainly ways in which I think all those things can be essays, but I think, so what? Like, who cares? Why can't we just talk about it? Why do we have to put so much emphasis on sort of what category it fits into? But yeah, I think definitely, like Chris Marker's work is always called documentary, which makes no sense.
Yeah, a few years ago, I showed The Case of the Grinning Cat on my campus.
Yeah.
And it resulted in, I think only one or two people were involved in this. It resulted in a series of grinning cat vandalism incidences on the campus, and I got a lot of anonymous pictures of grinning cats in my campus
That's
mail.
amazing.
I think I figured out who it was, but anyway.
Did they get an A?
Oh, it wasn't for a class. It was for like a community. I do like there's the French embassy offers colleges money to show French language films.
Oh.
So you can apply for a grant to get them, and then so I showed that and La Jetée on the same bill, I guess, since it's easy to.
Yeah.
They're both short, so anyway.
Yeah.
It was far more inspiring than I thought it would be, so I was glad to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kristen, I wanted to ask you about, I guess, going back to the Peshtigo fire in Chapter 5, because it strikes me that of all of the moments in your book, the time that you spend with the Peshtigo fire and then the discussion that leads from that seems to be one of the longest sections in the book. And you go from talking about the phenomena of this fire in Wisconsin to the, I guess, the research conducted during the Second World War of using firestorms, as weapons. And it struck me. I remember the first time I was reading this that it would have been easy for you to use this moment of the book to make, I don't know if you want to call it more of an overt political statement, or to kind of implicate certain leaders or moments in history when it comes to your larger theme of decay and ruin. But you resist that. You kind of pull back. And you do something similar when you talk about certain towns, even large cities like Detroit, but smaller places like Gilman, the abandoned mining town. You always stop short in terms of pointing fingers as to, what business, what individuals, what entities are responsible for this. And you take a more, with a small g God perspective, you kind of pull back to look at the larger picture. And I'm curious, in writing this book, did you feel that tug to become more specific, to perhaps point fingers?
I don't think in the writing. I mean, certainly as I was reading and learning about it, I felt, very angry about certain players and certain people involved. And I felt, for me, one of the most, horrifying things I'd ever sort of learned throughout research was the fact that Allied scientists had built these whole little mini towns in Utah to test bombs on them. And they built them sort of exactly replicating, what a German home would look like, what a Japanese home would look like, to find a way to burn them, as quickly as possible, which is a really just horrifying thing, and I certainly felt, I certainly felt a desire to point fingers, but not necessarily in the work, because I also just wanted the reader to sort of come to that on their own, I think. And also, if you, there's a page in there in which I lay out all of the furniture that was built and before it was burned, and one of those things is a crib. There's no way to see that and not sort of feel that anger on your own without being told.
As I read this book, one of the other works that came to my mind, comic wise, at least, was Art Spiegelman's In the Shadow of No Towers, where, which seems to be meditating on a similar, but taking a kind of different track, idea of the nature of the ephemeral, that the towers, the twin towers, which are supposed to be, we're in our minds, are supposed to be these kind of permanent things that never go away, collapse in an instant. Whereas, and then he gets into, old comic strips that were never supposed to last, that were supposed to be thrown out, and yet those stand as kind of monuments. And what your book made me think about that is kind of taking a third step, which is, but all this stuff's not going to be around. If we think about the Twin Towers as being permanent, that was already an illusion, no matter what we're thinking.
Right.
And these comics will be gone too someday as well.
Right. Yeah, totally.
So is there, but I'm one, so what that then led me to think about is just, imagine wanting only this as a kind of post 9/11 work, because I think the World Trade Center attacks only get mentioned really, really very briefly once in the list of the worst explosions and disasters where Peshtigo fits in relationship. Otherwise, it's not there. But I don't know if it's the kind of artificial juxtaposition in my head of Spiegelman's work and your work that makes me think about this. But I mean, are we in a time now where we may be thinking about how about the ephemeral nature of civilization?
I think so. I mean, I like thinking about it in terms of a sort of in a post 9/11 way. It's hard for me to speak on that just because I was in high school when 9/11 happened. I certainly wasn't an artist in any way. It informed my upbringing so much, like very instantly. I mean, my mother was really, we grew up in Wisconsin, but I can sort of see this moment when, like, my mom was really never the same after that. Like, she just saw the world so differently. And I think that informed, my upbringing a lot. But yeah, I think we are sort of seeing the ephemeral nature of things. And I think probably a lot of that has to do with climate change and the way that's becoming so visible. And it's a sort of undeniable thing at this point.
Well, there's that telling section.
I think that's a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that telling section in your last chapter where you imagine, and you say you like to do this, what parts of New York may look like with the global warming and the rise of the waters. And then you have a 4-page series of images from different perspectives, what different parts of the city may look like. And to me, one of the most effective is the one you repeat the image that opens this section where you're looking up in a series of these tall buildings, but you can tell that and this is on page 271, when you're looking up that it's underwater because you see a shark. Yeah.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I When I was thinking a lot about ruins, I was obviously just spending a ton of time on the internet looking at pictures of ruins. And there's like all of these subsets of people who are just interested in ruins and then are creating these sort of computer generated images of fake ruins. And there's this whole like huge number of photos on the internet, fake photos on the internet of fake underwater ruins. And they're terrifying. I mean, it's really like, if I look at them at night, I can't sleep, or I have really weird, terrible dreams because there's something just so scary. There's always been something so scary to me about the ocean. I love being on the water. I love being near the water. But the bottom of the ocean, to me, if I think about it, I feel like a real surge of panic because it seems so sort of unknowable. And I just find that so fascinating that there are all of these sort of computer artists that have created these sort of fake worlds under there. And after Hurricane Sandy, there were all of those people photoshopping pictures of sharks in subway stations and stuff like that, and flooded subway stations. And I just like thought, what is our obsession sort of with this? And I think we've seen it so much certainly in like apocalypse movies and things like that. It's like one of the first things that happens is, what would this city look like underwater?
What do you call it at one point? Like ruin porn?
Yeah. Which is a term that I coined. It's sort of critics have been using it for a little while now.
Yeah.
When researching all of this around the time of the book, I mean, did you find that the subject matter was almost overwhelming to you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things some of the best things my editors did for me was help me pare back. I went to a lot. I researched and wrote about and traveled to a lot of places that didn't end up making it into the book. And I think I just had this sense of, I have to put in, I have to prove that my obsession with abandoned cities is real. I have to show, all of these, but they were sort of like, you don't need that many in order to sort of prove this point and prove this idea. So yeah, it was, I think one of the hardest parts about making something full length is knowing what belongs and what can go.
Is there are there kind of deleted scenes or separate essays that you're thinking about doing something with that would come out of those things that you left behind?
There's definitely a lot of cut pages and a couple of cut paragraphs or a couple of cut chapters. I don't necessarily have plans to do anything with them. I think they're maybe best left in the drawer.
Was your piece from back in November of last year, The Safest Place in Kentucky, this appeared in the Oxford American. I'm assuming that this sprung from your work on Imagine Wanting Only This?
Yeah. And I sort of imagined that some of that would make its way into the book, and it just inevitably didn't quite work.
Mm-hmm. Because some of the visuals where you start off with the fan above you, of course, reminded me of some of the scenes from the book, but then you go in a different direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I felt like I had more space in that piece to sort of just explore the history of that one place in a way that it just didn't necessarily contribute to the narrative in any way when I did that in the book. I also just I'm just really interested in these sort of strange histories of places. And I felt a need. It's always nice when I hear someone sort of speak positively about the fire section in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, because I just felt like everyone's going to say this has no place here. Like, what's the point of this? It's sort of like this mini tiny book within a book, and the form is very different. It takes on like the sort of 2 panels a page, and it's just a very historical narrative. And I was really worried about how people would respond to that. So I think a lot of the history that I wanted to include just didn't quite have a place.
That's interesting because that section definitely does stand out, and what you described there is different from what the rest of it is. But also your prose style seems to become more lyrical. The images aren't unless you're dealing with your ancestor. That forms a kind of narrative. The images aren't really matched completely with the text, and so it is an interesting section, and I think it creates an interesting experience.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that you mentioned a moment ago the resistance to categorizing a particular work, but given what you've done here in Imagine Wanting Only This, and also your various essays and reviews, I mean, do you consider yourself a comics journalist? Because if I think many people that you're about to go on a book tour, they're going to introduce you as a graphic novelist, right? But do you think it would be more appropriate for someone to call you maybe a comics journalist or a cartoon journalist?
I have no idea. I mean, does this feel like journalism to
you? Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, these are interesting questions that, we see all the time. We see like for example, if you ask referring to Phoebe Gleckner as an autobiographical cartoonist, she resists that quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so it's how much of it is under the artist's control about what they get labeled or what their work gets labeled. It sounds like when you were saying the graphic memoir label kind of comes from your publisher, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's something that's fine. I mean, I definitely, when people call me a graphic memoirist, that seems to me wrong, because I made one graphic memoir, and I don't think I'll ever publish a memoir again until I'm maybe much, much older. If I ever do again, I do feel like the graphic will remain, but I don't know that the memoir will. But I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of working in comics journalism, but I was a journalism student in college and, didn't pursue it because I just was so terrified to interview people. So there's just there's ways in which I feel like I definitely don't have the journalism chops, that it would take to do something like, Joe Sacco does or someone along those lines.
Yeah, because the closest there's the research, kind of historical work you're doing in the Peshtigo section. But if we take like maybe Gilman, Colorado as being the most journalistic aspect of it, you kind of interview a couple people and then that's it.
Right.
And not pursuing that any further. And I think that fits well into this narrative. If you were to pull that out and say, here's a piece of comics journalism, they might, well, why didn't you go to the town? You had the opportunity to go to the town. Why didn't you go there?
Yeah. And I think for me, so much of this book was just about like sort of my failure to see a place fully, or a fear to see a place fully, or a sort of self-consciousness. I mean, I think so much of being a writer or of like pursuing any story is just like feeling really stupid a lot of the time, and feeling like really out of place and kind of confused about how you're supposed to navigate it. So I did want to represent that a little bit.
Well, in the book, there are a few of your friends from the past, and I know that you've given them different names, but the names in the book, I'm thinking of Andrew, Mary Helen, with those individuals or any that you like your family that you reference in this book. Did you consult them and ask them what their take was on these moments where your lives overlapped?
Yeah, especially with my family, especially with my Uncle Dan. I talked to my mom and dad about that a fair amount, and about their sort of experiences. And then Mary Helen that's her real name. She was totally psyched and fine about being in the book. And my ex-fiance, I sent him an email once to let him know I was writing the book, and he said, "All right, have a good life." That was sort of it. So we certainly did not speak about it. We haven't been in touch in a long time. We were very young in the period that I write in the book, and I have no idea how he would feel about the representation, or whether he would think it was fair or not. I sort of sometimes imagine I'll run into him on the subway or something and be like, "Here you go, have a read. Let me know what you think."
Well, in doing the book, what were your experiences in handling the history of the heart disease in your family? So what is it? Ventricular tachycardia?
It's a mutation of the Lehman gene, which leads to ventricular tachycardia.
Yes, and so in writing this book, did you find yourself pulled in a direction to get maybe more personal about your own the possibility of yourself suffering the same kind of medical issues that other members of your family, like your Uncle Dan, has.
Yeah, I was never really that interested in exploring it, and I felt very uncomfortable about. I mean, that was to me some of the most difficult sections to write because I felt very uneasy about doing it. I felt like, I loved Dan very much and we were close, but certainly that tragedy for me was nothing like what it was for his children and his wife. And so I felt a lot of guilt, I think, about writing it the whole time, even though, I had to talk with my mother about it and she was very moved and said, he would have been so touched, and it sort of felt like I had her permission there. But I do feel some, I was very worried about it, and I'm still very worried about it. The rest of my extended family reading it, I kind of hope that they just don't, to be totally honest, because I just don't know. It just feels very scary to sort of put something out there and to have someone recognize themselves in a book and maybe not feel comfortable with that representation.
With this being your first book, I would guess that this is your first book tour that you're about to begin next week. So you're going to begin there on the 19th in April. You're going to be at the Housing Works bookstore in New York.
Yes.
And so tell us about what you're looking forward to on this book tour and some of the places where you're going. And you're going to be near me, in fact.
Yeah. Where?
Dallas.
Will you come out and we can have a drink?
I hope so. Yeah, that's a Saturday,
okay,
right?
Good.
I see
good.
April 29th.
I'm in Dallas for 2 days, actually, 2 whole days, which is like the longest stretch of my tour. I'm in Dallas for 2 days and Houston for 2 days. I'm really living it up in Texas.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I'm back. I feel back and forth about the tour. I feel very, very grateful to have one and to have a publisher who put that together for me and is supporting me through that process. I feel really lucky, and it's certainly something I always thought I'd want to do, but never thought I'd really have the opportunity to do. I certainly didn't think it would be 15 cities, which feels like a lot. But I am also feeling very tired. Like I'm feeling very surprised by the amount of work sort of this stage of the process is. I sort of thought I had made the book and that was it, and I'll just sit back and the media will come in and then I'll be done. But there is so much sort of back and forth and logistical work and, the interviews and the writing of, the little pieces for whatever to go along with whatever article and stuff like that is more time consuming than I thought. And it's a very strange kind of anxiety too, that also takes a fair amount of mental energy. So I'm definitely very excited for it. A hard part of that was just figuring out how to represent comics on a projector while I read, figuring out how to do that properly, which took a lot of time.
Well, you have a publisher like Pantheon who is big enough to support something like this. And another thing I'm curious about, speaking of your publisher, is did you know from the outset that you wanted to go with someone like a Pantheon or maybe specifically Pantheon?
Yeah, I mean, Pantheon was definitely like my dream publisher. I don't think they're certainly one of the best, if not the best, publishers of graphic work in North America, particularly for the kind of graphic work I liked, which is more nonfiction-y and literary and things like that. It was certainly my hope, but I never thought that they would bite on it ever. I thought that was just a pipe dream. So I was very surprised when they were interested in working with me.
Because, when it comes to trade publishing, Pantheon really was about the first and really the most significant to begin publishing comics or graphic novels. There have always been comics publishers, right, that not only work with periodicals but books as well. But for a major trade press, they were very prestigious. And so we're on their mailing list, and everything that they send us, I feel like I have to pay attention to. And I can't say that with most of the publishers whose mailing list we're actually on.
Yeah. I love everything they do. And they do. So one of the other reasons I thought it was such a pipe dream is they don't do, for that many comics each year. For as sort of storied as their history of comics is, they did Art Spiegelman's Mouse and, Chris Ware and Marjane Satrapi and all of these, incredible comics artists, they do, a handful a year. So it just seems like such an improbability.
They just looking at your tour dates that Derek was mentioning, they do have you on they do have you going around the country. I mean, you're in North Carolina at the end of the week that this is going to go out, and then in California 3 days later.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of, I remember my publicist said, I know this flight's early, but like it should be fine, right? And it was at like 6 a.m. in LA, which means what? I have to get up at 3, and I had an event the night before, and then I was supposed to like go in and do an event that afternoon. And I was just like, I just don't think that's going to work. So there is sort of that condensed, and a lot of that had to do with my own work schedule. My day job is I'm a managing editor at a small press, and I just couldn't be gone for, a full month. But ideally, I would love to have, a day in each place in between the events and get to relax a little.
And to check out the locations, too.
Exactly.
So when you're going to be, you talked about thinking about ways in which to represent comics on a screen and stuff. So you're doing readings. How are you approaching doing a reading of a comic?
So I've done a handful in the last couple of weeks, and I sort of had a chance to test it out. And I really owe the comics artist Amy Kurzweil, who wrote Flying Couch, who told me about Keynote, which is they have this thing called Magic Move, where you can sort of animate slides and move between panels. And I owe her forever a million drinks, because she really helped that. I only did one reading from comics ever before, and I had just the pages sort of stationary behind me. But it's definitely less engaging than, how when you read a book, a graphic book in your hands, you sort of look at the page and then you can sort of move through each individual image. So allowing the images to move a little bit on the screen, I think, more accurately replicates that reading experience.
Because I just at my school I just had Sophie Goldstein and her partner Carl Antonowitz came, and they did a reading of their comics, and it was a blast. It was a lot of fun. So we have an interview that I tried to do with them at a Waffle House. I don't know how listenable it is, but we ended up talking a lot about that, and they got the inspiration. They talk about, where they first kind of figured out how to do this or what to do with this by watching Tom Hart read from Rosalie Lightning, which I can't imagine.
I've seen, I saw him read from that too at the Society of Illustrators in New York. I think that's what it's called. And I was, I've just idolized him for years. I was waiting for that book for years after I heard about it. I just think he's so incredible. And he reads, I think, in a similar way. He sort of puts the pages up and sort of reads over the top.
That's got to be, that's got to be just an incredibly emotional experience. I don't know.
Yeah.
To be the creator behind that and doing that, let alone being the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm continually totally amazed by him and his work, and he's been extraordinarily generous to me. I think that's where we met, actually. I saw him read, and I went up to him afterwards and said hello and wrote to him a couple of times afterwards, and he was just so kind and open in a way that I have not seen a lot of other, people be in the comics industry. He just was so welcoming.
Wow, too bad you're not heading down to Gainesville on your tour.
I know. Maybe someday, yeah.
Well, good luck with that tour. And Kristen, we want to thank you very much for being on the Comics Alternative and talking with us about your new book, Imagine Wanting Only This.
Thank you. This was so fun.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so we got into a lot of stuff with Imagine Wanting Only This and talking to Kirsten Radtke about it, and I don't know if we came to any conclusion about questions about genre and things like that. But I do find such conversations interesting, even if they don't result in any kind of definitive conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. I still think that I feel most comfortable with the word meditation in describing this because, I mean, there is that memoirish quality that you can find in meditation, but especially where this book ends. I mean, literally the last couple of pages, for me, it's like it set a tone that when I went back to look at everything else before the very end, it changed the way I looked at the beginning and the middle parts.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that I would definitely put within the meditation category. So we had a great conversation. We want to thank Kristen again for taking the time and talking with us. And good luck on your tour that's going to take you all across the country.
Yeah, that's exciting. So if any of our listeners are in one of the areas where she is going to be speaking, and you can find her schedule on KirstenRadtke.com, go check it out. Like I said, it's a great book. I highly recommend it, and I'd be curious to see what she does at her presentations that we talked about at the end of this interview. Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned her website, KristenRadtke.com. That's KristenRadtke.com. Not only can you find out information about her upcoming tour, but also you can see other works that she's done.
Yeah, that's right.
Some of which we've referenced in our interview.
Yes.
Yep. And if you like to hear interviews with great creators like this who do great books, not only should you keep coming back to the Comics Alternative to find these, but you could also check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service, because they have these kind of books at great discounts. So that's dcbservice.com. You got to go there. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our interview with Kristen Radtke. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can get in touch with us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. And you can also get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed, which you can check out at the number 2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us, let us know how we're doing, and find out what we're doing.
That's right. And we do like to hear from you. Until next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.